Arts High School since 2007, and his practice in the studio and the classroom is synonymous. He is doing that same work in both of these two spaces. JC is represented in numerous public and private collections, including here at the Delaware Art Museum, a purchase that was made possible through the support of museum guides. At the end of our talk, I'll share some information about JC's current and upcoming solo exhibitions. JC, welcome to Art Chat Weekly.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here.
JC, before we begin, you made, I thought, the really good suggestion that we start this conversation by inviting all participants to consider accepting discomfort throughout our conversation today. And I heard recently in an online chat that we can't always ensure a safe space for dialogue, but we can nurture a courageous space. This is a space where we listen to understand, we make room for diverse voices, and we embrace ambiguity. And we acknowledge, and I will certainly be the first to acknowledge, that we are all on a path of continuous learning. And sometimes we find ourselves feeling a little uncomfortable in that journey, and that is okay. We can embrace that. So JC, as I said in my introduction, you have been exploring race and identity in systems that uphold whiteness. And you've been through, beginning in 2008, focused on two main bodies of works, the drawings, which are collectively titled Unfinished Business, and the sculptures and objects collectively titled Melanin Chronicles. Now, whiteness is a term that some of us are hearing perhaps for the first time being discussed more widely in media, social media platforms. And with that acknowledgement, I'd like to invite you, JC, to start us off by speaking to what the term whiteness means to you. And while you're speaking, I'll be sharing some of your images of works of art that look at this construction.
Sure. I would just say that for me, whiteness is an ideology, right? It's a systemic ideology, right? It's a system of ideologies, right? So for me, it's about questioning that term whiteness, right? In whatever capacity that is, because I think there are, you know, the microcosms and the macro, right? And I think whiteness is something, when I'm interested in something, I want to know the origins of it, right? Before I speak on anything, I want to know the origins of it. Like, where did this thing called whiteness come from? And what is it to claim whiteness? What does that look like? What does that mean? And the work is extremely personal. I mean, people always ask when this started, as if I have some disease or something, but it started in childhood. I mean, I felt this discomfort as a kid, right? Growing up in Oklahoma and New Orleans, and having a grandfather that was Native American, Chickasaw, and not knowing him was uncomfortable. Being in a single parent household and being thrown back and forth from, you know, mother's family to father's family, and also the neighborhoods that I grew up in, which were highly diverse. I think that's one of my greatest privileges, is, you know, growing up in Blackness, with Blackness, right? So it's something that, you know, has somewhat, you know, it bothers my 9-year-old, right? My wife is from the Bahamas, so my kids are considered interracial. I don't know what that means, but it's interesting how this ideology versus belief is something that's always interested me too, right? So what comes first, belief or knowledge, right? I always think that the knowledge would have, I mean, belief would have to come first, to where we have some sort of doubt in our mind that it's just a belief and we don't know, right? So I'm not sure any of us know what whiteness is, right? And particularly for me, I mean, I've always questioned, you know, as a kid, being called cracker or being called, you know, a white kid or whatever it was, it bothered me, right? So for me, I question, what is a white man? What does that mean, right? So I want to confront that, what that means, because I do think that that everything is not black and white, right? And there's a gray area, right? And the gray area is what I'm interested in. The gray area is what I'm questioning, right? There's an author, a Pan-Africanist named C.L.R. James, and he talked about subcultures yet defined, right? So we have these black issues, we have these white issues, and then we have these subculture issues that haven't been really dealt with, right? To the extent of the black and white issues. So this whole division of black and white has always bothered me. So that vulnerability of being bothered is something that has always interested me when I was introduced to this thing called art, right? Because I didn't grow up around art. I didn't, you know, I didn't know anything about art history when I got to college. All I knew is that my grandmother said, you know, be the first one in your family to graduate college, right? And I asked her what I should study, and she said, well, you've always been interested. This is someone with a 5th grade education, my grandmother, right? A white woman who picked cotton right next to black people. But she said sociology or art. And you know, I think that's, you know, I question art just as much as I question whiteness, right? I think the work is a series of questions. There are no answers here, right? It's just a series of questions of things that I'm interested in discussing, and it's things that me and my friends have discussed or do discuss every day, right? So I also look at the work as a form of resistance to this system of whiteness or this thing called whiteness or this ideology, right? Because I always talk to my students about artistic intention, right? So when we walk into the studio, what is our artistic intention? Is it to share? Is it to create? Is it, you know, it's the same in pedagogy. When I walk into a classroom, what is our pedagogical intention, right? And I think revolution is always part of that, right? Change, I mean, people fear that word revolution, but it's just change, right? Like you know, I think change is inevitable. So, and I compare vulnerability and discomfort to something withheld. So if someone intentionally withholds something from you, that moment where you are engaged with what was withheld, whether it was information, let's just compare it to information. Something is intentionally withheld from you and then you find out, right? And I'll give one scenario that I remember very, very vividly is when I got to the University of Oklahoma and I found out about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is the largest race riot in this country, right? And it happened in 1921. It was the most prosperous Black community in the history of this country. You had Black folks making, you know, $500 a day in 1910. You had the first Black-owned theater. You had, you know, Black police officers, and that community policed itself, and this country feared that economically, right? And I think that's part of it too. I think that's part of whiteness is fear, right? Fear of the unknown, right? So I do want to say too that I think whiteness is somewhat comparable to the failures of democracy. I don't think that we live in a democracy. We live in the failure of democracy, right? And the definition of democracy is the absence or disapproval of hereditary or arbitrary class distinction or privilege. The absence or disapproval of hereditary or arbitrary class distinction or privilege. That's all we see, right? So the absence of that is what I want to engage with, right? And I think especially in this time that we're weathering so many emotions, right? So we're weathering the emotion of this pandemic, and then we're weathering the emotions of the other pandemic, right? Because racism is a pandemic too, right? There's differences to what kind of pandemic it is, but I do think that it's something that needs to be discussed, even if it's, you know, a hypersensitive issue. I think I invite that discomfort and I invite that vulnerability. So I'll say that.
JC, I've shown a few works that I think you're speaking directly to this work with these, but I want to shift next because as I mentioned in my introduction, and you said this so beautifully, the work that you do in the studio and the work that you do in the classroom as an educator has been tightly tied. And I think this image is really quite strong, and it speaks to knowledge, systems, structures. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about this particular work, and for our participants, maybe describing a bit the objects that are included in this piece.
Sure. Well, I think art and education are synonymous, right? So I think those two things are constantly in flux too, right? So they're always changing, but there's layers to it, right? So there's layers to what art is. There's layers to what education is. I always tell my students that I don't know anything, right? The only thing I know is that I have 2 daughters depending on me, and that I want to learn something new every day. So you know, people say that my students are lucky to have me, but I feel the direct opposite. Like, I'm blessed to have them, you know. And when I speak to someone, and what in art, like, what is there that we can't talk about, right? I mean, art is how we come to know the world, right? So would we know the art of Egypt if it wasn't for the artifacts that are there? So the objects in here are really about those layers, right? I think about, how do I arm my kids for what they're gonna face, right? It's a difficult, you know, the work is a form of resistance for sure, and materials are very important too. Like, I want to use things that already exist, right? I don't want to create anything new. I don't think I'm creating anything new. I want to use things that already exist, and things that have maybe been forgotten, or things that have maybe been pushed to the side or swept under the rug, or things that have been discarded. I'm very interested in things that have been taken out of circulation and putting them back into circulation.
And JC, with that too, I think there's also this sense, so as you're removing it from circulation, the altering, the putting it back in, with these really dynamic installations here, Unfinished Business, there is a sense of disorder and disorganization. And here I love this wonderful, you know, dynamic sense of everything being toppled out of this symbol that we see for the sharing of knowledge. This, you know, the school desk, and these objects are quite literally turned upside down, spilled, the contents spilled onto the floor. Talk to us a bit about that sense of maybe disorder, the adoption of a really dynamic installations that you include with the presentation of your work?
Well, I think about, there's two books that are so critical to my practice that really, really changed my life. I wasn't a heavy reader in college, or, well, I would say it started in college. In high school, you know, I think you're given information to read based on the dominant ideology. So when I finally got my hands, like someone handed me Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and I was 21 years old. And I can just remember reading and rereading and thinking like, this is for me. Like, it was the first time that I read something and I thought, wow, this is for me. And there's he talks about Western education being an epistemological fatalism, right? So to me, there's so much to uncover there, right? This ability to unlearn, right? And, you know, Einstein said something about, you know, your education is what's left after you forget what you learned, right? I think certain things stick and then certain things fade away. Like what we know, and I think we have to be able to confront why something didn't stick, right? But these installations were, I've always been told that, you know, that I need to tone it down in the classroom, or, you know, I don't know if these kids are ready for that, right? And to me, it says a lot about the administration. I always say that, tell my students that I work for you for free, right? They pay me to deal with adults, right? But I think that there's so much to undo. So to me, like, these installations are part of that undoing. And then what do we do with what we just have, you know, intentionally undone, right? So the response to this installation was so good. I mean, even some of the students in Connecticut, this was at Real Art Ways, and I've always wanted to recreate it, but there was something missing. There was something missing from the installation. I think the day before it opened, I kept going back to the space thinking there's something missing. And what was missing was life, like some form of life, some form of hope. So what we did is we went to Home Depot and we got some plants, right? And when you see these, you know, illegal dumping sites or whatever it was, that's what it really inspired me, because I pass going to work every day, I pass these illegal dumping sites. So that started to register with me about, you know, space and about abandonment and about, you know, discarded or waste, right? And how wasteful we are, right? So how do I subjugate that into something tangible where I can recreate the layers of something that's been abandoned or discarded intentionally? And then also, you know, when you walked around it, there was also a sound element. So when you got close enough, there was a motion sensor that kicked on the radio to NPR. So there were these issues that were constantly playing too, right? But you had to be there, you know, you had to be close enough to it to engage that part of it. But then also to see these plants growing out from underneath these things that were been discarded really brought the whole piece together, right?
And JC, I think I love, I did not know that there was a sound component
Mm.
to this piece. And I think just knowing that, looking at this image, the installation, there is this wonderful quality of layering in your work.
Mm.
And it's the layering of, you know, past knowledge, new knowledge, the questioning, the continual searching and questioning and examining that you do. And I think when you speak about, you know, kind of forgetting all of that you've known, what happens afterwards, you build all of these questions and considerations back up. So I turn here and I'm kind of shifting us to look at the series Unfinished Business. And for those participants who've seen this work in person in the Delaware Art Museum's Contemporary Gallery, it's always on view. For many years now has been on view in the Contemporary Gallery. You share this exploration process with your viewers. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about this kind of, it's almost a little diaristic, you're sharing this exploration. If you can talk about that through the lens of this particular work, It May Not Be Televised.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm an avid reader, right? I have, if I'm not reading, I feel like the work is really, really stagnant. And then I also have conversations. I'm working on a project right now called The Art of Listening, because I'm interested in what that looks like, right? What does the art of listening look like? And I think me becoming a father really made me more aware of what listening means. So this particular work right here, it comes from a conversation, and I just spoke to Mr. Melvin Edwards not too long ago, which is, he doesn't like it when I say mentor, nor do I, because it's just a friendship that we've established over the years. He was my chairperson when I was in grad school, one of the few people who would even have a conversation with me at the time. But we had a conversation back in 2000, I don't know, maybe 2010, 2011. And I think there was some, protesting and things going on for, these things that we see that keep repeating themselves, right? Whether it was police brutality or mass incarceration or something. We had this conversation, and we had a conversation about the poem by Gil Scott Heron. And Mel made a comment that it may or may not be televised, right? And that we can't be concerned with that. We just have to make the work, right? So I made this thinking about him, thinking about that conversation. And then to visit the museum and see that it's in close proximity to his work, right? Really shows that there's, me and him are connected at the hip. I don't know what it was. It was just, it's a human thing, but this conversation came from that. And, I collect images just as well as I collect objects. So for me, an image is an object, right? But I always look to see how I can transform this object, as I do in the sculptures. How do I take something and subvert it or deconstruct it and then reconfigure it the way I think it should be viewed, right? And you can do that with images and then this idea of text always comes from me being in the classroom. I mean, a lot of the drawings that I make, are based on conversations I've had with young people, right? And then also like this whole idea of technology too, where everything is, being surveilled or is under some sort of video scrutiny. So yeah, I mean, I've been to protests, I've been to riots. It's not a fun place to be. Even my daughter recently, I took her to a protest and, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I wish we didn't have to do this." And I said, yeah, me too. And then in my mind, I'm thinking about, I wish, there wasn't racism. I mean, I wish there wasn't, it's always made me feel uncomfortable when someone says something derogatory about someone else. And that it took me until I was an adult to confront it, right? But yeah, I mean, talking to her about that, and then I thought about the criminalization of the Black body, I thought about, that film that was created called Birth of a Nation, right? That film, it was propaganda to criminalize the Black body, right? And now you have like Ava DuVernay and other people making films or documentaries like The 13th that is directly linked to this problem we have of mass incarceration. So all of those things come into play when I'm thinking about unfinished business. I'm thinking about what issues are we dealing with that are unfinished, right? And how to finish an image or how to finish an issue, right? Because I do think this is about thinking, but it's also about rethinking. I think the rethinking part is most important. And my students are always, what do you mean by rethinking something? Well, if we have a conversation and then we go our separate ways, when we reconsider what was spoken, then we're rethinking, right? So I always say this too, that I don't want to talk about right and wrong. I think that's so overdone, right? Because I think our conscience tells us right from wrong, right? So I want to deal with what is so, right? So if our conscience tells us right from wrong, think how much space there is to just deal with what is so, right? But it's also about not remaining neutral on what is so, right? I think that's a convenient place to stay, right? But yeah.
And JC, some of this, in thinking about what is so, what exists, considering these, some of this can connect directly to, and so much of it does, connect directly to policy, to existing laws that have been on the books for decades. And it takes something else to happen, and a public finds themselves in a position of being beholden to a law that was established in 1910 in this example.
Well, it's also having the power to make laws, right? Because a lot of us feel defeated in the sense that we don't have that power to implement that. And as individuals, that's probably true. But I think collectively, right? I think collectively, we do have that power, right? I think we give them too much power, right? I think power is a funny thing, structural power, the power to make a law, right? I did a bunch of research when I was in grad school about slave laws in New Jersey, right? And some of them would really surprise people if they really knew what was on the books, right? Talking about whether you had native blood or black blood, that you would follow the condition of your mother, right? Like these little laws. I mean, look at the law that they created for this gentleman right here, for Jack Johnson. The Mann Act was created for one man. It was put on the books for one man, Jack Johnson, because he was traveling to these fights and he was dating white women. So the Mann Act made it illegal to cross state lines with a white woman, right? So those kind of laws, and it's funny too, like how convenient it is to create a law, right? It's just like this orange guy we have in the Oval Office, creating laws about, who could vote or what kind of ID you needed to vote in the last election. I mean, that's how he won Wisconsin, because there was over 100,000 black votes that didn't get counted because of an ID issue, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's problematic, I think also this idea of poverty too. I think these laws have directly affected, the separation or the disparity between those who have and those who don't have, right? So I don't think anything happens by accident. I think exactly what we're facing right now, right, and what we've been facing for decades is intentional, right? Class structure is intentional, right? It's not something that just happened by accident, right? And I've been reading a book too called Stamped from the Beginning, and it talks about the origins of racism, right? And it talks about how they implemented laws to protect white people, right? Not to protect all people, right? Or to protect capital, you know? And it's no different. I mean, if we want to bring that to a current sense, they brought over the Israeli forces in the late 80s, early 90s to teach police forces in America how to protect capital. And they used the same tactics that the Israelis use on Palestinians. So you see that with the militarization of police departments. I mean, they were given, I mean, there were laws put on the books that you got more funding during the war on drugs, during Reaganomics, right? You got more money for these military uniforms or these weapons, right? So, yeah.
JC, I want to shift to looking at this other main body of work, the Melanin Chronicles, and talking about some of, I think these next two images that I'm going to show. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've been working with this form, the boxing glove, for some time in various iterations and installations of it. If you can talk a bit about the combination of these existing objects and forms.
Sure. I mean, boxing comes from me being a kid, right? So it's funny, man. My daughter, I was playing dolls with my daughter, and she asked me, "How am I a dad and a kid?" So I thought that was such a profound question. Like, how are you a dad and a kid? So I think that there's part of, like, most of this work is extremely personal. I had an uncle that lived in Las Vegas when I was a kid. So when I would act up, they would ship me to Las Vegas for the summer, right? And my uncle was a huge boxing fan and used to take me to the gym, used to take me to, boxing matches in Las Vegas. But then I started looking at boxing different when I got to college. I started looking at the idea of training, or the idea of resistance, or the idea of combat, and also someone asked me a few years ago, like, what does boxing have to do with race? And I was like, what does it not have to do with? Like, how many people, has boxing changed their life, And there's a certain amount of discipline that comes with the sport, right? I was a wrestler too, so there was something about this one-on-one, right? And I look at art a lot like that it's me against everybody else, right? So it's the same with, the gloves. This piece right here, protect yourself at all times. I kept looking at this school desk as this symbol of colonization, right? And I just think that every time we sit in this school desk, that there's this recolonization that takes place. But I talk to my kids about all the time about ciphering out, my students about ciphering out what's true as to what may be myth, right? Or what reality versus myth, right? And I get people all the time that say, yeah, race is a myth, like, I don't see color. I see color every day. And there's a certain amount of invisibility that comes with when you don't say you don't see color, right? So I think race is both a myth and a reality, right? And again, like, I want to know the origins of things, right? So when I hear something being taught in a classroom, I want to know the origins of that thought, right? So again, I talk a lot about Socratic questioning to my students, right? How do we develop questions in a way to shape the conversation, right? Or to push the conversation where we think it needs to go, right? So, yeah, and I talk to my, these, like I said, these works come from conversations, but yeah, the boxing has always been and again, like objects for me are vessels of inclusion, but also vessels of memory, right? So when I see something, or when I find something that's discarded, or I find something that's used, it interests me because I want to know who has held that, right? It's like a book. You know, a book is a vessel of memory, but also a vessel of inclusion too, because how many people have touched that book, right? How many people have touched those boxing gloves, right? Where have those boxing gloves been used? Like everything in between the glove and the finished object interests me. Everything, the whole transformation of that object. Because to me, like that's part of art's transformative function, right? Like how do we, and that's always interested me too, like how do we transform someone's way of thinking, or how, I think we can do that the same way we can, you know, transform an object. And I think self-transformation, we live in a time where that's very, very important, right? Um, and I think, you know, growth is real, and there's something called cognitive dissonance that I think about a lot too, right? Frantz Fanon, who wrote Black Skin, White Mask. He wrote A Dying Colonialism. He wrote Wretched of the Earth, and he talked about cognitive dissonance. You know, when you're giving evidence or you're given truth, right? That somehow what you've previously been taught overweighs that new truth, right? So again, like, you know, it's painful sometimes to learn new things, but I think it's more painful to not, you know?
And JC, I think it's really, so not only are you creating the drawings, the sculptures, the objects, that your viewer is, you know, experiencing in a gallery space, in an installation, you are creating spaces that support conversations. You're creating spaces for engagement as well. And these last few works that I want us to look at really invite that engagement on the part of the viewer. They share these books. I love how you talk about this installation, actually. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about what you've created here with this work.
Well, I think this brings us full circle from what we initially started the conversation with about, you know, the power of an object, right? And I've really been, I questioning art, right? So I've been questioning for a long time. I've always been engaged in, I've always been, I won't say consumed, but yeah, I am consumed with community engagement. So I always think about the limited power of an object, right? So for me, like a drawing can only do so much, right? I mean, it can create a conversation, but it's not really intentional. But an object can do that too. An object can create a conversation. I said, but I kept asking myself, like, how do I create this environment for conversation? So thinking about space, right? Thinking about form, thinking about questioning, like how do I bring all of those things together? And again, this piece came from a simple conversation that I heard between two thinkers. Because I don't really believe in art. I don't really believe in visual art. I believe in visual thinkers, right? And I think there's a big difference, right? I don't know, I'm sure you're aware of Arthur Danto, right? But Arthur Danto said that the history of art officially ended the day that Warhol made the Brillo boxes. Because he said after that day, anything could be art. So I do think that there's a new way of thinking about it, right? I think Joseph Beuys was, you know, when I first started creating these social sculptures, I didn't really know who Joseph Beuys was, right? But I think my first social sculpture was 1993 before I left undergrad. And then I didn't revisit it for a long time. But once I started getting, these offers to have exhibitions or to be in exhibitions, I started thinking about how can I, create this scenario or create this environment within a space that would engage people, that people would not have a choice whether to engage with one another, right? And I think that's important too, because again, this idea of inclusiveness, right? So I started thinking about, okay, I'm interested in this information. How do I make it accessible, right? How do I make this information accessible? Something that may not be in the forefront of the discussion around a certain issue. And I started thinking about trying to implement some sort of audio and some sort of engagement where people could control the work, right? Where they had complete control of what happened with the work. So this particular piece here was just an idea to allow the public to become a DJ, to allow the public to become the author of what would happen in this space, right? And I think that that idea, back to that idea of power, like I want to empower the community to have these conversations that they may only have with their friends, right? And to have discussions that confront their own vulnerability or their own discomfort, or to create, a positive experience that could possibly transform someone's way of thinking, whether it's about art, whether it's about race, whether it's about whiteness. All of those things are the layers of what I'm interested in.
JC, I could keep going with more questions, but I want to make sure that we have time. I'm going to put this slide up and invite our audience to ask any questions that they might have.
Sure.
And Amelia, I have not been following the chat if anything has come up there.
JC, you mentioned a couple books that impacted you early on, and I know you said Pedagogy of the Oppressed was one. What was the other?
Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind. I mean, I can go down a list of authors that that I engage with regularly. Bell Hooks is another one, where she talks about the spirit of intellectual openness, right? Where we welcome deceit and create a space to transform the world, right? And where cultural diversity influences every aspect of our learning. Those things, I get friends all the time that are like, how do you quote that so often? And I was like, because I've read it so often, It's almost like this idea of freedom. There's a beautiful gem of a book by W.E.B. Du Bois called The ABCs of Color. And he talks about freedom in there. And he said, like, freedom is a state of mind, a spiritual unchoking of the wells of human power and superhuman love. So at the end of the day, I think that superhuman love is what we need, right? And I'm no humanist either. I mean, I love nature, but I'm not a tree hugger, right? So, I think superhuman love is necessary, weathering all of these emotions that all of us are feeling at this point.
Thank you. Participants in the audience, questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
No?
There was one comment, JC, about how intertwined your teaching practice and your works of art are. And I know you spoke about this a little bit in the beginning with Margaret, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about, the impact of those students and how that's affected your art practice.
Well, I say this to my students all the time, and I always say that nothing I say is original, right? That everything has come from somewhere. But Warhol said that he would have never created a piece of artwork if he didn't have a conversation. So I have conversations with my students all the time about my ideas, right? So, you know, and I learn from them much more than they learn from me. I remember leaving graduate school and feeling a sort of emptiness. You know, you go for 2 years and then you're kind of out in the real world. But I remember walking up to Mel Edwards and telling him how much I appreciated him, and him looking at me saying, you know, I learned much more from you than you learned from me. And I was like, what? Like, how is that possible, right? Because to me, he was, you know, he was everything to me. So I understand that now after being in the classroom for so long, like how important that intellectual openness is and where it can come from. You know, I remember when I first got to the Arts High School, which was the first high school in the country dedicated to the arts. It opened in 1931 as the industrial school of the arts, right? And it's influenced the arts school in New York, and DC and Los Angeles, everywhere in the country. This was sort of the foundation of all of that. But I remember a teacher coming to me and say, I don't know why these kids love you so much, right? Very, very derogatory. But I just calmly said, you know, maybe because they understand how much I love them. I said, you should try learning from them. You know, it's much easier that way. But she looked at me like she smelled something foul, like learning from them. And I think that's something that has to be addressed in education too, because these kids are coming from with their own experience, with their own history, with their own culture. And if you're not open to learning from them, you're probably not going to teach them too much. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's inseparable. I mean, I still speak to students that I taught 20 years ago. So, and they still make fun of me. Like, I remember when you used to talk about Cuba, like we kept asking ourselves, like, what's Cuba have to do with art, right? but but it's interesting how these relationships are still, you know, I'm just as grateful for them as they are for me. That's for sure. I don't know if I answered your question, but
You did, thank you. Other questions or comments for JC?
I had a question.
sure.
Hi, I'm curious, you know, you're talking about learning from your students. What are you seeing? What kinds of changes, if I'm sure there are you seeing in your students' art and art expressions, you know, with everything that's been going on and, you know, with Black Lives Matter? Is there a change that you're seeing? Or is it just—
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, I do see a change. In particular with kids that may not been as engaged before, right? But I've been in it so long that I always see that change for a moment, right? But I always talk to them about moments versus movements, right? And how can we establish this as a movement instead of just a moment? And then again, like, how committed are we to the issue, right? Because I think about that a lot. Like, how committed to this are we, right? And I'm talking about as human beings, right? But you know, and then awareness is part of it too, where they may have heard that this stuff happens, or they may have experienced, but they didn't realize what kind of scale it's on, right? Because it's not just an American problem either, right? When we talk about hyper police activity, right? Or people dying in the hands of the police. I mean, now all of these things, other things are surfacing too. But I think I told my principal that we need a space for these kids to discuss these things. Yeah, they're gonna make artwork about it, but they need a space like we're doing here, where we can just openly discuss what we're feeling. Because I can tell you this too, that although Newark is a Black community, there are subcultures here too. And then there's issues within those subcultures towards Blackness, right? So I have kids coming to me asking, you know, what to do about my parents or my grandparents hate Black people, right? And those discussions are very heavy too, because, you know, at some point that discussion has to be had, right? From the look, I've learned more from my 9-year-old in 9 years than I could teach her in a lifetime. So I think we have to be open to listening and learning from these kids, because they all have something to say, and we need to give them a platform to say it. And I'm really passionate about that because I see it, how much of a necessity that it is. You know, we had a discussion at my school where we had 50-something colleagues on a WebEx call, and everyone's talking about what emotions they're feeling and all of that. And I just pointed out that we're adults. Like, think about what these kids, if we're feeling these kinds of emotions and we're weathering these kinds of emotions, what are they weathering? And especially if their best friend is Black, but they go home and their grandparents are saying something derogatory about Black people. You know, like, that's got to be hard for, it's hard for an adult. It's, you know, so I'm, you know, but yeah, I do see it. And I try to, look, I don't want to force my ideology on anyone because it's something that's always changing too. But I do try to encourage them to really, really look at the world and really, really look at yourself and find your position, because it's out there for you. Because just like Melvin Edwards told me, that all he ever tried to do was make the world a better place, and that job is still out here for us. So, yeah.
Are there any final questions? JC, I don't know how anyone follows that. That was an amazing way to possibly end our conversation.
Yeah, it's really true. I had a conversation with a friend this morning, and he said, we really need to pump up the volume a little bit, right? And I said, yeah. So that, you know, when people say things to me in the early, that sort of sticks with me all day, right? So I do think at the end of the day, that's what it's about, trying to make the world a better place. And whether that's through art, whether that's through conversation, or whether that's just through, you know, self-affirmation, I think it's important.
Well, JC, thank you for sharing your art and your words and your recommendations with us as well. I am so grateful for you and of your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure, Margaret. Yeah.
And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah.
As well.
All right. Take care. You guys have a lovely day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.